We can start. So my name is Joy and I'm one of the staff with 10C. There's a few folks who are facilitating this evening. I'll sort of start and then I'm going to hand it over to Paige, who will moderate the discussion with our panelists. And then Patty, who's with the Guelph Arts Council, will be sort of bringing us to a close. And then we do have, I don't see her square, but we have a woman named Angie who's here, who's going to provide live closed captioning. And I see a few other familiar faces from Guelph Arts Council and stuff, so that's great. But we'll basically open the evening, host the panel discussion. The chat will be open. I'll be monitoring the chat. There will hopefully be some time for questions, and then we'll close with a guest from Ontario Trillium Foundation at the end. So my name is Joy Sammy and I'm of mixed Indo-Caribbean and white settler descent. I want to begin today by acknowledging that Guelph Arts Council and 10C Shared Space reside on the ancestral and current lands of the Attawandaron, Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Métis, and that these lands are home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. The land where we reside are guided by the Two-Row Wampum Agreement, Treaty 3, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. These treaties characterize our promise of peace and friendship as we journey side by side and represent our responsibility to share and care for this land, its bounty, and its people. The journey that has led to this event tonight started with a realization at 10C and at Guelph Arts Council that we can and need to do more to contribute to decolonization through art, through awareness, and with our local Indigenous community. This opened up great discussions, and I think what sits with me the most is a reminder to really challenge our own worldviews. And when I say our, I mean Western or European worldviews. So be it our understanding of art or how to build a program that supports artists, there are so many different ways of knowing and ways of doing things, and we're only better when we embrace that diversity. And that's really been sort of a foundation of how we've come to this point with this panel, which is looking at how to build a program that supports Indigenous creative people. So the two panelists that we have with us today are Dawn Russell and Peter Schuler. Dawn is a multidisciplinary artist of Acadian and Micmac heritage. He was born in Stephenville, Newfoundland in 1970 and currently resides in Cambridge, Ontario. I am from the west coast of Newfoundland, typically referred to as the French Shore, but also rich with Micmac culture and history. The forests in this part of the province are thick with spruce, birch, and alders. In areas, the forest is nearly impenetrable as trees mesh together and form a barrier of branches, twigs, and the indistinguishable haze of foliage. My ancestors have lived on this land for untold generations, and my connection to this geography and cultural heritage infuses my work at every turn. And that was a quote from Dawn. Peter is a grandfather and elder of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Peter is a member of the, and I wrote this down, Minwewegon Minduin Lodge in Manitoba. Since retirement from construction work, he has taken these stories to elementary and high schools and works to educate the public in an effort to fight racism and to promote understanding of First Nations history and culture. In his retirement, he has co-taught a course entitled Introductions to Indigenous Environmental Knowledge with Professor Dan McCarthy at the University of Waterloo. And it's fantastic to have both of you joining us this evening to speak of your experience, both as artists and as Indigenous artists, and we know you also know each other well, so that's fantastic. And I think in addition to the questions that we sort of have prepared for tonight, I know Paige is really excited to talk to you because she's sort of fangirling over this opportunity. So I'll pass it over to Paige, and if anybody does have questions or comments, please feel free to put that in the chat.
Perfect. And I'm just spotlighting Dawn and Peter, so hopefully you're able to see and hear them a little bit better. I just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm really excited about this discussion, and a big thank you to Dawn and Peter for joining us for this discussion. each of the questions that I have, I'd like to be answered by both Don and Peter. They both have wonderful practices, and I think that we can learn absolutely so much from these two incredible men. The first question I have, and I'm going to direct this first off to Peter, is how is your work tied to the land?
Well, a lot of things that I do, I don't really consider them art. Or other people call it art, but that's just things that I've been making, and a lot of them are ceremonial items. And I have this little project going, which I call the Buckthorn Project, which has to do with a piece of land on New Credit, where I have put up a sweat lodge and started to build a roundhouse. And it gets the name Buckthorn Project because that part of the land is being taken over by an invasive species, which is called buckthorn. And my idea was to try and cut some of this buckthorn out, which is really dense, and to try to let the native species come back. And when I started that, I started off by taking my tobacco and offering that tobacco because I was going to take the life of these trees. But I also asked the question, what can I learn from these buckthorn trees? What can I learn from this? And so one of the things I looked at was, how does this buckthorn work? What does it do? How is it able to choke out all the rest of these native species? And so as I looked at that, I could see that this is kind of a mirror image of how colonialism worked to get rid of us off the land, to force us off as the indigenous peoples. And I see that these buckthorn, they are get their leaves first in the springtime. They grow really fast. They produce berries really young, and they choke out the young trees that are here, the native species. They shade them out so they can't grow, or if they do grow, they grow really slow. And I believe also that buckthorn puts things into the soil that slows down or prohibits other species from growing. And so when I look at that buckthorn tree and I see all those ones that are keeping the young ones of the native species from growing, it makes me think about the residential school and how the residential schools, and I don't like even call them schools, conversion camps, were put in place to prohibit us from being growing up to know who we are, and to kind of stop us from growing into what we should be. And but also when I looked at that buckthorn tree itself, when I started to cut this wood, I see this wood is really nice. Has a nice color, has a nice grain. It's kind of hard to work with. And I started to use that wood to make the handles for my rattles, or to make the tops and bottoms. And I wanted to appreciate the beauty that's in that tree. Even though it's a pain in the butt, I wanted to also say this is good for something. And it's not, and that's how we have to look at the people who came here. Even though they may try to shade us out, we also have to appreciate they're just human beings like us. And we have to try to learn how to get along together. And so even this past spring, Don came and we made a sweat lodge from those trees. So what I'm trying to do is get the colonizer to do what I want to do, not what he wants to do. So I'm trying to work together to do something good. So that's kind of, and I have this little doodle here, which I don't know if you can see this doodle or not, but this is a little doodle here that has to do with water. And at the very top, you see some rain clouds, and you see the river, and you see fish in there, and you see all the birds and animals and everything that has to do with the water. So this is just a doodle. And that doodle, it comes from the land. It comes from what I call my relatives, what you call the environment. So that's the shortest answer I can give you.
Thank you. It was beautiful. And Don, how has the land entered into your work?
I think for me, mostly it would be memory. I come from Newfoundland, as you mentioned in the bio, and Newfoundland is a beautiful place. Obviously, the access to the ocean, it's always right there. So that water, going down to the beach was always a big part of my life. Being able to walk into the woods, you know, as kids, we would build forts. We'd go up and down those brooks, and we'd make little dams. And it was a very familiar environment, a very familiar place. And when we moved from Newfoundland to Ontario, it was a completely different place to be. Everything about it, the trees, everything. So I felt lost, really. I felt not connected to this place at all. And so for me, it was all about that memory of trying to, I suppose, connect to the place that I'm from and not forget it. There was always this hope that I could return there. And so I find that that's a big part of my work. But that would just be like in the beginning, it was a superficial way that got me into the work. And then over the years, I felt that I was actually feeling a connection to this place they call Southern Ontario. And I wanted to connect to the lands here. So I started to do a few projects that you would describe as land art projects involving stone. They were quite large, monumental, and they evolved slowly. And how I began those is I had an idea of what I wanted to do, but I left a lot of it open to see what would come in. And that's how those projects developed, was slowly over 3 to 4 months of time. And allowing things to be a little bit open made all the difference in those projects. And the reason why I say that is because it was like a conversation with the land, and I needed things to come in differently. So that was, that's been a real challenge of mine as an artist, is how does the land, or my connection to the land, how does that inform my work? And I feel that it's evolving as my understanding evolves. And that understanding also includes a spiritual understanding of where we fit in. And so as I grow with my understanding, so does my work in its connection to land.
Wonderful. And you touched on a point there where you were talking about conversation and taking time to make work. How important is process to you in the work that you do?
Is this me?
Yeah, we'll start with John, and we'll jump back over to Peter after.
Okay. Process is a big part of it. I don't like to predetermine. I might have, say a painting, I might have a flash or an idea that comes from my experience. Maybe it's out for a walk, I see something and it sticks with me. And so I let that, what's that word? Percolate, to allow it to percolate a little bit and see what kind of comes up in the painting. So often my paintings have 5 or 6 paintings underneath. I could work on a painting for 20, 30 hours, suddenly see that this is not it, and completely abandon that. And it's not like I'm covering up that painting, because the painting is still there underneath. Because I work with wax, I'm always removing the wax, and there that painting underneath kind of shows itself. So process is absolutely intrinsic to what I do.
Thank you for that. And Peter, does process enter into the work that you do? Oh, you're muted as well.
Okay. I'm kind of like Don when it comes to it's like recently I made a hand drum which I painted, and I don't know how to describe this, but an image came into my head of like a concho belt that a woman might wear at a powwow or in a ceremony. And I wondered, could I put that around this hand drum frame and how I could do that? And so I thought, well, maybe I can carve that in there. And so I took that hand drum frame and I started to do that. And by the time I got that all carved in there, and I had painted the conchos with gold paint, and I would burn like a belt around it. By the time I got that far, I see that there has to be a woman on that hand drum, and it's like you allow things to appear. It's like you, I heard other people who carve stone and whatnot, they say, you have to let the stone reveal itself or what's in that stone. And that's how I look at when I make, I don't do that many paintings, but when I start something, I just put a dot there and we'll see what comes from that dot. And part of that is, it's hard to describe, but I can tell you a little short story. I don't have any short stories, but anyway, I tell you this, how this came about. I made this little painting on wood, and it was only about 3x4. And I make these rattles and a cow horn and wood. And so part of that is kind of repetitive. So your mind kind of goes on autopilot. And when your mind is on autopilot is when things appear. And in this process, I was using a little router to make these pieces fit inside this horn. And when they got too small for me to safely work with, I was throwing them in my kindling box, which would end up in the stove. And something told me, don't throw those away. It was like an instruction, do not do that. So I fished them out of that box and I stuck them under my bench. And as I'm working away, kind of got bored doing what I was doing. I thought, what am I going to do with that little piece of wood? So I took one of those pieces of wood and I'm looking at it, and that's what came to me. Make a dot. So I got my wood burner and I made a dot on there. Those dots turned into tree stumps. And then there was a group of people, indigenous people, with their backs towards you, and they were looking towards all these tree stumps. And in the background was marks on the wood from a saw, and I put some ink on there, and they turned into trees. I didn't do anything, and then I put a different colored ink on there, and you had a sunset, and these ancestors are looking at a clear cut. That's what came out from that. But that's not the end of the story. That was Monday. On Wednesday, I'm going to the university, and I drive along to Highway 24, and I took the back road into Kitchener. And on the way, I see on the right side of the road, these contractors were cutting all these trees down because they were going to put a subdivision in there. And I was running late. And so I was, looked in there, glanced in there. I kept on going. But a mile down the road, something said, you have to stop, you have to turn around, and you have to go back in there and look. And so I'm driving my car, and I turn around. I drive in this thing where I should have been driving a truck and thinking I might get stuck in there. But when I drove in there, what I saw was exactly what I had put on that thing, minus the people standing there looking at it. And so I took some pictures on my phone, and that little woodcut thing I made, you could hold it next to the picture on the phone. And it was just a continuation. And that is the process. And I can't describe that any other way.
That's beautiful.
And you have these things happen, you say, did that really happen? And I think when you come to that point, then you're making that connection with the oxoconic, those spirits that will guide you into doing something that somebody can learn from or see something from.
I've heard you speak in the past about listening to that inner voice, and is that what is tied to the process of your work, is really just listening?
Yep.
That's beautiful. I know earlier today, Peter, you mentioned that you don't necessarily consider everything that you make to be art. How does the Western way of thinking about art differ from a more Indigenous perspective on art?
Well, when I see paintings by the masters, I guess you want to call them, the European art, I was lucky enough to go to Paris one time, and I went into the Louvre, and I saw the Mona Lisa, and I saw all those paintings, and to me, they kind of reflect the Western worldview, and that worldview only looks at people. And that may be a very unfair statement, but it seems like, it's centered on people and not on nature. And there are exceptions to that, but the great lot of it is centered on people. And when we look at Indigenous art, you can go look at a birch bark canoe, which we wouldn't necessarily consider art, but it is a piece of art. It's a marvel of engineering. Some of our ceremonial items, like a ceremonial pipe, that the bowl is made from stone, and the stem is made from wood. If you take a piece of sumac, you can carve that, you can make a spiral, you can do everything with that. And the different layers give you different colors. And you can take a coat hanger, heat it up red hot, and stick it through the middle, and there's your hole through the middle. You can do the same thing with white ash. And it's hard to describe when you're working on those things. It's like you see it, and you have to bring into being what you see, and it's really it's something that is going to be used for another purpose, but it becomes art. And there's usually a story that's connected to that. So I don't know if that helps you out.
No, I think that was a wonderful answer. I know in the past we've had discussions in developing this program around the idea that many Indigenous languages might not have the term art in the language. That's not something that is defined individually compared to other adjectives to describe something.
Yes, well, there's like, in my cupboard behind me, I have a pair of gauntlet mitts that were given to me, and they were from way up north someplace, and they're fully beaded cuffs and everything. And, you know, they are art. You know, whoever created that was an artist. And, you know, the man who gave it to me, he's no longer with us, but when he gave them to me, he was in the last stages of cancer. And when he gave them to me, he says, "I want you to use these." And you know, if someone had given them to him when he was working as a teacher in the far north, and someone had given those to him, and that in itself, that giving was art.
Beautiful. Don, do you have anything to add on that thought?
Usually when Peter says a few things, I'm left pondering for a little while, and he's done it again. So can you please repeat that question?
For sure. How does a Western way of thinking about art differ from an Indigenous perspective?
Yeah, that is something I'm learning, I would say, and that's something I'm learning every day. I certainly started art fully in a Western tradition. I went to university for it. I studied painting, I studied drawing in a classical sense. But even when I was at the university in the early 90s, I would find myself on the 5th floor of the library looking in the native art section. And I was always wanting to learn more, but there was nothing there. You know, the teachers weren't talking about it. It seemed to me that when we had discussions about contemporary art, that this was the world over, that many traditions could be part of what is contemporary art, that contemporary art wasn't just Western. I love Japanese contemporary art. Absolutely love it. So this was in my mind. We don't talk about Indigenous art, and I wanted to learn more and more about that. So I would go to the library and look at these books, and then I would do doodles and drawings that at the time people would call primitive art. And I didn't see it as primitive art. That's one of the categories in Western art history that they call something primitive art. It's also a part of the 20th century art as well with certain artists. But that's not what I was trying to get at. I was trying to get at something else. I guess for me, when I would look at these photographs of objects, let's just take a mask, for example. When I'd look at that, I'd wonder what went into it. Why were certain decisions made? Why was it made this way, not that way? And there was no answer, certainly in the art history room. And all I could do was try to mimic it in drawing and doodling. I even did a few carvings, small little carvings to try to connect to that. So I think that there's, you know, like the Western world looks at things very concretely. And that's how we approach painting. But when you look at Indigenous art, there's something else going on there. It's not a picture or a depiction of something. It is something. And that something has power, perhaps. You know, like Peter speaks about the rattles that he makes. Those rattles have a purpose, they have a meaning, they have a place and ceremony. Yet every one of the rattles Peter makes are different. They have the choice of color, the choice of wood. All of these things are informed by that process that he undertakes to make. So there's two things, right? You've got the beauty of the object that was carefully considered, but it also is used for something that has great meaning. And so, you know, like the mitts Peter was talking about, you have to use them. So I'm fortunate to have one of Peter's rattles. And when we use it in ceremony, sometimes it gets quite muddy. You can't be precious with it. You look at it first, maybe the first couple of times, look at it, oh, I got some mud on it. scrape that off, wipe it off. After a few more times, is no chance. Now the mud and the stains are kind of part of that. So that object, in a way, is alive. It comes to life in a completely different way. And it isn't precious that we just put it away and revere it and study it as we do with Western art objects.
That ties back into that idea of process, and the process ongoing past the creation point to its life after creation, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
Absolutely.
And so as we're this artist talk is kind of the culmination of our project as we're trying to work towards building an Indigenous artist in residency. And I just want to ask you guys, and this can kind of be more of an open discussion between you and Peter, about why it is important to create an alternative residency framework specifically for Indigenous artists. What barriers might Indigenous artists find in more of a traditional artist residency program, and what things may need to be prioritized as we try to create an Indigenous artist residency?
I guess I can flap my gums here. One of the things that I thought about after was one of the difference between Western art and Indigenous art, is that I would tend to think that Indigenous art is more spirit driven than Western art. And when it comes to looking at Indigenous artist in residency, I think that it is a matter of education, of educating the Western world. And I take every opportunity I can to educate European Canadians, or Canadians wherever they come from, about our belief system, about our worldview, and to try to make them think about the land itself, and that try to change their way of thinking. And in part, that's why I agreed to work with Professor Dan McCarthy at the University of Waterloo. And, I think they call that ERS, Environment, Resources, and Sustainability, which is an oxymoron. And I say we should change that to mean every relative is sacred. And I'm talking about our non-human relatives. And when you treat the environment as a resource, sustainability doesn't really enter into the picture. It gets talked about, but they're not trying to sustain the environment. They're trying to sustain the flow of money from the environment. That's what they're trying to sustain. And so, when we can try to educate the people and have them look at the environment as a relative, whatever part of that environment is, you're going to look after your relatives much more closely than you are a resource. And so I think with the Indigenous artists in residence, we have an opportunity to further educate the public. And, this is something that's not new. we've been trying to educate the public for over 500 years. And, you know, a lot of what we say is dismissed as myth, as legend, as whatever you want to call it. And I think the world is slowly waking up to the fact that you can't keep on doing what you're doing. You can't keep trying to fix the problem with the problem or the thing that caused the problem in the first place. And I've talked to quite a few academics and educated people, and I say, why are you trying to fix the problem using the same thoughts and ideas that created the problem? And I think Einstein said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, it's a definition of insanity. And I think that's the way we stand now, is that we're just plain nuts if we think we can fix it by using the same ideas and philosophy that created the problem. That's my short answer.
John, do you have anything to add on that?
Yes. Yeah, Peter and I were talking about that question earlier, and so I'll put in the bits that Peter forgot, which was simply that it's part of being a neighbor, knowing your neighbors, and that kind of concept. And I think from what I've experienced from Canadians, for the most part, there seems to be quite a bit of a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. Education is key. People need to know. And I think to have somebody come into the community that has something to offer, people could learn from, that's a great way for education to take place. So I mean, I hope that with this program, I don't know how it's going to look for you or how you would choose people, if you would have a call out there and people would just apply for it, or would you do it differently? Would you maybe select people and invite them specially? I think that could be something to consider. And, you know, yeah, there's so many opportunities there, so many possibilities of how that could be just a fantastic way of people getting to know one another, really.
That's the hopes for the program, is for really connections between communities. With that, I actually have one more question, if you guys are willing to take a surprise question, I guess. What role does art play within First Nation, Métis, Inuit communities that could help connect people back to their communities and to the land? I'm particularly thinking about how majority of Indigenous people are living in a more urban setting than potentially their ancestors were. So I'm wondering what role art plays in that in their lives.
That definition of art is, I think that changes from person to person, place to place. So that's tricky to answer that. And certainly all the different cultures, Indigenous cultures across Canada, would have different ways about that. I'm thinking about Mi'kmaq culture. I was talking to someone about this today. How Mi'kmaq culture had their own kind of fashion. Women wore these hats, these conical hats that were woven similarly to how baskets were woven. And they're just terrific. And at some point, that kind of expression has disappeared. I don't see Mi'kmaq people today picking up that traditional dress in any way and trying to reincorporate it back into today's world. And it's a shame. But that just makes me think that each nation, each culture has a very unique expression, and that's going to have different importance from place to place. that would be my answer.
Don, Peter,
Well,
you want to go? Perfect.
Part of what Don is talked about with things we don't see anymore. I'm just thinking back to the way I grew up. I grew up without too much exposure to my culture, no exposure to my language, no exposure to ceremonies, and you know, it was something I had to go look for, and it's something I had to walk upstream or against the flow to connect to, and it required a conscious effort, and it required being vulnerable. And I always remember the first time I went to Medewan ceremonies. You know, everyone was keeping time to the drum with Shishigwan. And there I am, and my hands are empty. And you know, you want to go like this, but you can't. And so when we look at art, I'll show you something here, maybe. One time I was out walking on the land and I found this painted turtle that had been probably killed by a fox or something. And it was just an empty shell. And so I put my tobacco down and I took it. And Larry McLeod from Nipissing, he showed me how to make a rattle out of it. And so I made a rattle, but not with this shell, but with another one. And the way he showed it to me was the head was sticking straight out. But while I was making that, I saw what this one was going to look like. And it looks like this. The head and the handle, but the head is looking around. And so, you know, being on the land, finding that turtle, which is my clan, that drew me even closer back to the land. You know, I grew up on a farm. I grew up in the country. I don't like living in the city. I don't even like going to the city. And you know, when we're taken away from the land, there's something missing. And I'm not just talking about Indigenous people. I'm talking about everyone. And a lot of times you don't realize it's missing because you don't know. It's like if you never heard your language spoken, and if you don't know that language or what's in that language, you don't know what you lost. And we have so many things like that we don't know what we lost. And it's not until you start looking for those things you realize how much you have lost. And when Don's talking about those conical hats, you don't miss that if you don't know it's there. If you're not aware, you're not going to know. And so when you start looking into the history of things, it would be possible for one group to meet another group and know and recognize they're from a certain area because of the way their clothes were made or the beadwork or whatever that was that made them separate. Even to know maybe what clan that person was without asking because of something they had with them, or you know, that kind of thing. Like there is so much buried in the language and buried in the artwork and buried in birch bark scrolls and things like that, that learning that is like going to university, but going to university forever because you can never learn it all. And, you know, and I'm just talking about what little bit I know. When you start going across the country, and you have the Cree people, you have the people on the West Coast, you have the Lakota people, you start going to the East and you have all those peoples, and everyone has something different. And, you know, going to ceremonies, the ceremonies are on the land. Going into the bush is a ceremony. When I go back to where my little, what do I call my Buckthorn Project there, when I enter the bush, I stop, I take out my tobacco, and I address my relatives. Bajon in the way magnaduk. Shemi guch ne wabandan gin. Thank you that I see you and I hear you. And I stop and I listen to the birds or the frogs or even the wind blowing through the trees. And you know, from that comes art. And I was walking at the Guelph Arboretum, and I saw something on a tree. It looked like a piece of glass or something. And I went and I looked, and it was, I believe, a ponderosa pine tree. And I took some photographs of that with my phone, because I said, here, Don likes to paint or do pictures with the bark. And so I sent it to him. And it's such a beautiful thing that I saw. And it just caught my eye, and it was just a tiny, tiny thing. It looked like a diamond stuck in the bark. And the colors and everything that are there just boggles my mind to know that, you know, people walk right past it and never see it. And that's, you know, coming from the land. That's where that comes from. And it's like you have a gift sometimes, that you see something that no one else can see. It's something that's right in front of everyone, but you have to be looking at it a certain way or whatever to have that jump out at you. And if you can do that, if Don makes a picture from that, that's going to show people the beauty of that tree. And it might be something they consider just a mundane tree.
That's beautiful, Peter. Thank you. I think Joy has some questions or comments to share from the chat.
I think reacting to what you've just said, Peter, there's a comment from one of the folks in the audience named Sandy, and she said, I sit and look out my window to the parking lot by my low-income building. Small trees dug up from somewhere and dropped into a hole in the center of green space. I talk every day to the one by my balcony, but they remind me of what was just said, of how to connect back to culture. I feel sad for some of the scrawny trees that aren't doing so well. I'm not sure what to say to them, but I comfort them. It looks silly to other people here. I'm of settler background. She said, I have a question here somewhere, but I'm just not sure what it is. Just talking her way through and listening is important. I think it's a great reaction though too. And if anybody else has any other sort of questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. Dawn, do you have something, you have a reaction?
Yeah, I was thinking that, you know, one of the things about Indigenous teachings is it talks about people as human beings, that we're all human beings. So perhaps some things that Sandy heard, you know, make her realize that she's very much a human being. That's what occurs to me. Mm-hmm. And we connect to our relations.
Yeah. It makes me think too that in many Indigenous teachings, like your relations include the plant and animals around you, you know, and in Western European beliefs, we tend to create that hierarchy, you know, so we're not as connected. So the folks who are out there talking to their plants, you know, are reacting to something, you know, they're feeling something. Listening to you both too, it made me think of, you know, the sort of pursuit of meditation and those sort of different ways of connecting. And that I think very much what I hear in how you both speak about your process is that's, you know, what I would say from a Western European background call meditation is sort of very much a part of how you're sort of listening and connecting and hearing and sort of waiting for the land to speak to you in your art. That's also just maybe more of a comment than a question, but I see a lot of parallels between what some people I think in Western culture are looking for often, striving for, and but so much of it sits in process. You know, I think we're often looking for a product, but the way to get there is actually through process. Like that's the important part to work through. Yeah.
Ties back to what Peter was saying about you can't fix a problem you created in the same way that you created the problem in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And I love the connection made between like purpose, art, and story when you spoke about the rattle, and then that much Indigenous art, it's not a depiction of something, but it is something. I think that's fantastic. Like that, it's such a different way again of framing, you know, and it's, you know, sort of going back to what I said at the beginning, being open to understanding that there are different worldviews, and how we see objects or process or art is so important in figuring out, you know, how we move forward. And I think the relationship that both of you have with the land is really important. You know, and that seems to be a really strong theme. And I'm curious, you know, like living in an urban environment, how you sort of maintain that connection with the land. You know, do you have to go somewhere to do that? Do you feel like you can achieve that when you're living in a city or a town?
Well, when I go visit Peter and Lou, I feel the weight of everything just gone. It feels so good, right? And then when I leave, I know I'm going to try to hang on to that good feeling, that relaxed feeling for a while. And when I get back to the city, it just chips away at it, right? Luckily, we do live in an area where there are places you can go. I live in Hespeler. Speed River runs through it. We have kayaks, and we try to get out there a few times at least this year so far, and that helps. That really helps. But I think it's an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that you think about is if you think about wilderness, okay, there was no wilderness before Europeans got here. We were just home. And so when you look at a town and you got trees there, your relatives are still there. And they haven't forgotten what they're supposed to do. It's just us. We forgot. And so that woman who was talking about feeling bad for the skinny little trees, you know, you're making that connection. That is the same connection you could make if you went into the bush. And, you know, if you feel bad for that tree and, you know, nobody's watering it, go water it. You know, talk to that skinny tree, give it some encouragement. And, you know, so I hear people talk about, you know, sacred places. And I always think to myself, why is that a sacred place? Why is not the whole earth a sacred place? Why don't we treat it like a sacred place? And you know, like, I know there are there are places where there are stronger connections with different entities. And that's hard to describe, but you know, the earth is a sacred place. It's just that we forgot that. And you know, and that's part of the problem that you can't fix with the same thinking that caused the problem. And the problem was caused because we forgot about that. And you know, and one thing that I was thinking about afterwards when I mentioned that picture I took to send to Don from that tree, the art is also created by our relatives. The tree created that. And sometimes you'll see, like I have stones that will blow your mind away. And you'll be saying, how did that do that? I don't believe you didn't carve that, but it's just the way I found it. And you know, we think about, there's a place where you find these round stones, and people are always saying, oh, that's got round because it was rolling back and forth in the water. And I know for a fact that's not true. Because at that same place, you find all these stones that are shaped. Like I have that one that would blow your mind. It looks like a little bird. And what blows your mind is when you turn it over, there's a round stone inside of it. And so you have to ask yourself, how did it get like that? And you know, creation creates art. And you know, and from that same place, there was a woman wading out in the water, and she picked up this thing like this, stone about this big. And if you tried to make a sculpture of a pregnant woman, you could never ever outdo that one. It was just perfect. And you know, and that's just something that's found there. There are round stones that are that big. They're all made from the same kind of stone. And you know, I have one that looks like a turtle. It's even got marks on the back like a turtle, but it's just a stone that someone picked up and gave to me because they knew it was my clan. And so those things, you know, like when you talk about, does the art come from the land? How's it tied to it? Those are the things you see. Can't explain them. I don't have to know why it's like that. And I don't have to know who created it. I just have to accept it.
Sounds
And I
like,
don't have to.
I was just going to say that it sounds like taking the time to observe and listen and discover what the land has to show is a really important part to what you're creating, Peter. Don, do you have any remarks to respond to what Peter just said, or?
No, I mean, I think that's put so well. As he was talking, I wanted to go over my shelf and grab some stones and show you just one sec.
I know, do it for sure.
Round stone. But then I go, look, it's perfect. And then they go, no, it's not. But it is. That's a perfect stone. I found this at the Bay of Fundy back in '98 after finishing a Sundance that I was, at my first Sundance. And I found that stone, and there were millions of stones there as the tide was rolling out. But this one was the only round one that I could see, and it just jumped out, and I needed to pick up that stone. I pray with this stone. I hold this stone in my hand, in my palm, and I pray with this stone. I think this stone, when I hold it in my hand, it's like it vibrates. There's something to this. And I have another little one. I like finding things that have like an animal shape. If you can see that.
Might just want to hold it a little bit higher. And yeah, perfect. That is beautiful.
Well, it's not really showing it here, but to me, that's a polar bear.
I think, I don't know about everybody else, but I can definitely see it.
See that polar bear? Yeah. So it's just like, I could do that all day, every day. What'd you do today? I found 10 rocks. One looked like a, yeah, what they look like. I could do that all day. And that's part of that connection that I was saying to Newfoundland, the beach, because of all the different stones that we have there. And a lot of them are granite. They, you know, they get smoothed by the water. And that's sort of our pastime, is to go down and try to find shapes. So at my grandfather's house, I remember he had like a perfect foot, perfect, the arch and everything, toes, all of it. So
I mean, I don't know.
he's going to get a stone.
I wonder how many people here have their little stash of rocks in there, because I'm sitting in my office at home and I know I have a big pile of rocks behind me. So it's we have another Zoom call with our confessions of rock collectors.
I'm gonna show you this moccasin foot.
Yep.
You might just want to take it back a little bit.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh,
perfect.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the bottom and the side. That's your moccasin foot. My dad found that somewhere's up north, and he brought it home and gave it to me. And you know, it just looks like a foot with a moccasin. And I've had that for, I don't know, 40 years or so. And you know, and it sits on my bedside table. And you know, like what they say is that the rocks, the stones, they carry the collective memory of Mother Earth. And so when we use those rocks and in the sweat lodge, we heat them in the fire, and they become red hot. And we call them grandfathers, and we call them grandmothers, and so that's part of that healing ceremony. Is just to use those stones to help us. And you can tell them anything because they've been around for a long time, and they probably already heard that already. You're not going to surprise them. So, but you know, like these things like that are the Western view would say, well, you're just imprinting that on there, or you're doing something. There's a name for that, but I can't remember what it is. And I say, well, you think whatever you want. If it speaks to me, I'm listening. If you can't hear it, it's not my problem.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that, Peter. And thank you to both of you for showing us your rock collections.
Just a small smidgen.
I'm sure we could spend a whole night sharing rock collections, to be honest. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to both of you for joining us tonight and sharing your knowledge. It has been a wonderful night, and I'm sure we probably could spend hours more talking and asking you questions. But I just wanted to thank you for your time. I'm going to hand it over to Patty at this point. And I think we'll just go. Perfect. Go, Patty.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you, Mike and Vicki, for your kind comments and for being here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Patty Broughton. It's been my great pleasure to serve as Guelph Arts Council's Executive Director since 2015. And on behalf of GAC and our project partner 10C, I'd like to thank the Ontario Trillium Foundation for their support through a seed grant for this Artist-in-Residence development project. This project has also brought together an amazing group of people around it, and I've been so grateful for the opportunity to get to know and to learn from them. For GAC, I would say that this Trillium-funded project represents several steps in a longer journey. A few years ago now, Elder Bruce Weaver joined our board and staff for a conversation that set us on a path of developing a land acknowledgement. And along the way, we connected with Indigenous artists and elders, and by 2019, we had embraced our land acknowledgement as a living and evolving document. We'd grown in our commitment to elevating Indigenous voices in our work and started to explore an idea with our friends at 10C, with whom, in better times, we happily share space at 42 Carden. That idea was to co-host an artist residency project that would focus on Indigenous artists and reflect our shared commitments to community building and social change. We reached back out to Bruce and to Elder Carol Tyler, as well as to local Indigenous artists and people working in the social change space, and built a working group around this idea. And we also were able to create a practicum experience for University of Guelph Fine Arts student Brianne Pruill to begin to research artist residency models. So really, all told, I think we've been working on this project for about 2 years, and over the last year with the Trillium grant. I'm so grateful to these working group members, Bruce and Carol and Brianne, as well as Ash McCaskill, Michelle Peak, and Carolyn Van for their wisdom, their perspectives, and their encouragement. I'm also so grateful to my colleagues, my 10C colleagues, Joy Sammy and Jana Cutting, and my GAC colleagues, Fan Ling Swen, Brianne, and Paige. Thanks to all of them for their really excellent project management and research skills, and to Trillium and Canada Summer Jobs for the opportunity to employ Indigenous youth as project staff. The Trillium grant has given us the opportunity to engage Indigenous creatives and folks with arts residency expertise in interviews and workshops, to bring Indigenous knowledge and wisdom into our understanding of what this residency could be and could offer, to present this conversation with Dawn and Peter tonight, and to develop a philosophy and framework for the project that will lead us into the implementation phase. I won't name all of the people that this project has touched so far, but I'd like to thank Bruce, Carol, Dawn, Peter, Michelle Peak, and Jesse Buchanan in a special way for sharing their wisdom, their skills, and their time. We've learned through this process that art, life, and the land are intertwined. We've certainly reinforced that this evening through this conversation for sure. And we know that we want this project to launch an ongoing opportunity to provide Indigenous artists with space, time, and resources to create, grow creatively in community with others, and to connect to the land. This is not a program that 10C and GAC will develop on their own, but as we journey together, we'll continue to make community connections to support Indigenous creatives and our ongoing learning and growth as a community. As I do whenever I have the chance, I'd also like to thank the City of Guelph and Ontario Arts Council for their operating support of Guelph Arts Council. Thanks to Mike and Vicky for joining us this evening to help us recognize Trillium support, and to Dawn and Peter for this very inspiring conversation. And thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. Special thanks to Paige for moderating this evening. As you mentioned, Paige is very new to GAC in a way, just started at the beginning of May, so she's really jumped in, and I appreciate that so much. If there's anyone who is interested in sort of staying in the loop as we continue to develop this project, please reach out to either one of us. You can find me at Executive Director at guelpharts.ca and Paige at Programs at guelpharts.ca, and we'll keep you in the loop on the project of the progress of the project. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Oh, Miigwech for inviting me to flap my gums.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Don.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Don. Thank you, Peter.
They're great.